So let's talk about that. The weapons inspection. What was that about, and what was your task specifically?
Well, the treaty was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. It was a treaty between the Soviet Union and the United States to get rid of what they called intermediate nuclear forces. In the case of the United States, this was the U.S. Army Pershing II missile. Intermediate is based on range, so it's from I think 500 kilometers to 5,000 kilometers. Any missile in between those two ranges. The other system that we had was called the ground launched cruise missile, sort of like the Navy's Tomahawk, but it was fired by the Air Force from a ground launcher. We deployed both of these systems into Europe in the early 1980s in response to the Soviets deploying a system called the SS-20. The SS-20 was a road mobile missile that had 3 warheads. And when they brought the SS-20 in the service, it changed the entire balance of power in Europe.
How so?
Because it's a weapon that is mobile, can't be targeted, has 3 nuclear warheads, which means they're going to saturate Europe with nuclear weapons. They could blow Europe away and not be...
Why can't it be targeted?
Because they're mobile.
But mobile on trucks, right?
Mobile on large trucks that are designed to go cross-country over terrain. It's very difficult to target these things once they get out of their
Even with
station.
satellites?
Well, remember back in those times,
We
we didn't have the satellites that we have today. We
I see, okay.
different coverage. So very difficult to target. So we brought in the Pershing II and the Glickman as a counter to that. The Pershing has a it's a very fast missile, and if it was fired, it could hit Moscow within 7 to 12 minutes of being launched, which was very destabilizing because it meant that if there was a mistake, a miscalculation, the Russians would have to assume that it was a Pershing launch, and therefore they'd have to launch their missiles in anticipation. But if it was a mistake, if it was a bad glitch, they just launched, and we're now at war when we didn't need to be at war. The Pershing was a very destabilizing missile. And so the treaty was to get rid of them. And initially it was just designed to be just that. The Soviets declare all their missiles, we declare all ours. We send inspection teams to go in and verify their declaration. They do it, then we oversee the disposition, then we do follow-on inspections to make sure everything's good, and then it's done. The Soviets made a missile called the SS-25, which was similar to the SS-20, but it's an intercontinental ballistic missile. It's same concept, road mobile. It has a larger TEL, transporter electron launcher. It's a 3-stage missile. But the treaty was supposed to be signed on December 7th, or December 8th, December 7th, I think. And in November, the Soviets came in and said, we got a problem. The first stage of the SS-25 is pretty much the same as the first stage of the SS-20 missile, which means the way the treaty was written, the first stage is what's called a treaty limited item, which means it needs to be accounted for and destroyed. So now what they're saying is they have a missile that incorporates a treaty limited item, but it's an ICBM not covered by the treaty. Now what do we do? And they had a theory of inspection called perimeter portal monitoring, where you would go to a missile factory and establish a perimeter around it and monitor the portal, the only exit, monitor what comes out. And in this case, we would monitor SS-25 production to make sure that it wasn't covert SS-20 production. The Soviets found that to be so intrusive because originally the reason why they did that is the Soviets said, well, we want to keep some of our SS-20s. We want to keep about 80 of them in Asia, and that means that we have to continue producing low numbers of them. And we said, well, if you're going to produce them, then we have to monitor them, and then we're going to have to be at that factory and do all this stuff. And they said, that's too intrusive. We don't want you at our top secret missile factory.
Right.
But now, because they said, now we have to do that. So we took this plan that the Soviets had rejected, and now we have to implement it. And it was a plan that was incomplete, hadn't been well thought out. It was based upon the concept of a giant $12 million X-ray machine that was all theory, not reality. Technology had never been done before, and now we're talking about installing it in a remote factory 900 kilometers east of Moscow in the foothills of the Ural Mountains. As one of my colonels famously said, if something breaks, there isn't a Radio Shack around the corner. If it's broken, it's broken. This stuff needs to work. And what's interesting is that they signed a treaty and they just assumed that from the signature treaty you had 6 months until treaty entered into force, which was the 1 July of 1988. And the assumption was that the experts would figure it out. They'd figure out how to make this work. But as the time goes by, the experts were meeting, they couldn't make it work. And so what they said is the inspectors will make it work. Now understand that inspections isn't supposed to be that way. Inspectors are supposed to operate under a very rigid set of rules. There's no flexibility in inspection. You come in and you're told what you have to do. And there are limits, there are right, left boundaries. You do what you're supposed to do. There's no creative thinking. There's no imagination. There's no this. Suddenly we're put in the middle of the Soviet Union to build this advanced facility out of nothing. When we arrived, I was on the advanced party. When we arrived, there was nothing there, just a field in front of the factory. We had to turn that field into, a modern facility with, warehouses, inspection facilities, rail lines, data collection centers, housing, X-ray machines, the whole thing. And we had to do it within 6 months. And so we arrived in the Soviet Union. We got to work with the Soviets to make this happen as a team effort. And it was doomed to fail. It was overly complicated, the system. We didn't have enough time. We didn't document any of the material because this is all made up. It was all theory, and now it has to be reality. And the Soviets are saying, if you're going to bring a system in, you have to have documentation. You have to show us, what each part is, what it does, why it should be here, how it's going to be installed, etc. We were sitting there going, now we're just going to dig a hole and we're going to put the stuff in there. And they're like, no. So we're fighting with the Soviets on that. That's delaying things. The X-ray machine wasn't, nobody had ever done it before. So we had to build it up in New Mexico to test it. And I remember they finally got it up. Everybody had been trained on it except me. And I get this phone call from my colonel, Colonel England. He goes, Ritter, you're going to Albuquerque with me. I said, what am I doing there? He said, you're going to get trained on cargo scan, the X-ray machine. I said, all right. So we get there, but it turns out I wasn't going to get trained on cargo scan. I was just there because the laboratory had said it's ready to be deployed. And Colonel England was the guy who said, there ain't a Radio Shack here. If it breaks, we're in trouble. It's got to work perfectly. And so he brought me in because I was the dumbest person he ever met in his life. I was very aggressive and all this stuff, but when it comes to technology, I am Mr. Can't do it. And so I was to come in to be the test dummy. And I remember the head of Sandia National Labs, Colonel England said, it's going to be there. It's got to work every time. He said, don't worry. It's idiot proof. And Colonel England looked at him and goes, that may be so, but is it marine proof? And he goes, Ritter, sit down at the console. And I pulled out the book and we started going through scenarios. And he had thought this through. I guess he had already read it, but he went through a scenario and he had me follow the book. I'm following orders just like I'm supposed to. Go into the page, push this button, go to this page, push this button. And then he comes up with an emergency scenario. A cat had walked through the radiation area. I got to stop it right now. So I go up and I hit the button, stop it. Whole system freezes. And they're like, well, that's not supposed to happen. Well, that's what it said to do. It said, emergency stop, hit emergency stop. They're like, yeah, but the whole system's frozen now. So they're trying to reboot it. They can't. It took another 5 months and about $5 million to get the system back up and running because there was an intermediate step that they had just assumed people were going to do. That there was like a reset that you're supposed to hit over here, but they didn't put it in the procedures because they just assumed that everybody knew that it's like shifting gears. You just know if you're going to shift a gear, you're supposed to put the clutch in. Everybody knows I don't have to write in put the clutch because you got to put the clutch in. Well, I'm a Marine. I just read what's I'm told to do. I didn't realize I had to do some sort of clutch work over here. I hit the button, broke the system. And so I became a hero in Colonel England's eyes at that point in time. But this is the point. The thing dragged out, and it became very political, very contentious. Senator Jesse Helms was trying to kill the inspection process, and we had to learn to work with the Soviets to make it happen, to make it succeed. We would open missiles to inspect the interior of the missiles. We had to come up with procedures to do that. One of the things we were trying to do is because we couldn't get the X-ray machine, we have to measure the stage. So the Soviets came up with something called a stage measuring device. It's basically a stick with some lights on it. And you stick the stick down into the stage, and then you look through optics and you measure the ring and this and everything and all this. And the Soviets were very proud of their work. But for us, it didn't make any sense. So we kept going back and forth on what needed to be done. And so the Soviets finally produced the thing that we want. And I remember, I wasn't on this inspection, but I have a very good friend who was. So they go and they pop the lid. Everybody's there. You're worried about static electricity, because if the thing blows up. It's a solid rocket motor. Blows up, you're all dead. So everybody discharges the static. You're wearing special static clothes. And they put the stick in there, and it plugs into the power, the 220 volt power in there. And they put it in there, and there's a power surge. And the light bulbs inside the missile next to the solid rocket motors blow up. And the lights go out, total darkness, and everybody's just sitting there waiting to die, because you're waiting for the static to hit, the thing's going to ignite, and you're going to die. And about 30 seconds later, one of the Soviets cries out in Russian, "Well, boys, we're still alive." And so they quickly pulled it, everybody get the hell out of there. But it's, this is the kind of weird stuff that's going on. We're making procedures as we go along, which you're not supposed to do. Long story short, I don't want to bore your audience to death. We made it work. We made it work. It wasn't supposed to work. There was a crisis where the Soviets rejected the use of the cargo scan because they said it exceeded the parameters of the treaty. We said it didn't. The Soviets were right, and they didn't allow 3 missiles to be inspected. They sent them through when they were supposed to be inspected, and it could have ended the treaty. Could have ended the whole thing. Big, huge crisis. But we sent a delegation from Washington, D.C., and remember I said that Washington had punted to the inspectors and said to the inspector, well, we had the solution. We happened to have 2 very junior officers who were geniuses, and they knew the treaty inside out, and they had worked with the Soviets. They listened to the Soviets, and when the big delegation came in, they convinced them that the Soviets were right, that the Soviets were actually correct on the interpretation. And so we fixed it based upon the local knowledge that was developed, because they trusted us to do this. And they saved the treaty, and I say that they saved the world, because if that treaty had failed, we'd have these missile systems, and there would have been a mistake. The missiles would have been launched. We'd all be dead. But because we worked our way through this, in the middle of the Soviet Union, in the middle of a town where no foreigners had ever been before, at a ballistic missile factory, and like I said, in a strange nation, we worked with our Soviet counterparts and made a miracle happen. We saved this treaty. It's one of the most remarkable stories in arms control history.
This video is sponsored by you. That's because we don't have any sponsors. All we have are supporters like yourself. So please consider making a contribution to our channel. You can give to us via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description of this video. That way, we can continue to fly guests like Scott Ritter to our studio for an insightful podcast from which we can all benefit, like the one you're watching right now. So please consider making a contribution. Thank you for your support.
Trust nothing.